So we're going to make cornbread from one of my favorite cookbooks, my Betty Crocker cookbook that my mom gave me when I got married over 20 years ago. I'm going to walk you through the steps and show you what it looks like each part of the way and what it looks like at the end. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, I'm going to make cornbread because we're having chili tonight. And so because we're gluten-free in our house, we can't use like a cornbread box mix. We have to make it from scratch. And so I have organic cornmeal here, which is 100% certified gluten-free. And then I have a recipe from Betty Crocker that I'm going to use to make cornbread. Okay, so I'm using Betty Crocker's recipe, and it says to mix the milk and the butter and the egg together in a bowl first. So I'm going to take my butter, which I needed 1/2 cup, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in this bowl and then melt it. And while I'm doing that, I will add the milk and the egg. The recipe calls for 2 eggs. So I'm actually doubling this recipe, so I will put it up as a single serving. But because I'm doubling it, I need 2 eggs. We have a big family. There's 6 of us, plus we want the leftovers. So I'm going to make 2 pans of this. So the recipe called for 1 cup of milk. I'm going to double it to 2 cups. So technically these are like your liquid measuring cups. And so I'm putting my milk up to the 1 cup line. I did it twice. And then this is your dry ingredients type of measuring cup or scoop. So my butter is melted. It took about a minute, maybe a little bit longer to melt it completely. Especially with gluten flour, it's great to make sure that you use melted butter because it helps absorb into the rice flour, and the non-gluten flour tends to be very grainy, and so the butter being softened absorbs into that grain and then keeps your pastries and your baked goods softer and more moist. So I'm going to use my hand mixer and go ahead and blend those 3 ingredients. The recipe says to put the rest of the ingredients in together and then mix again. So I'm going to start adding the sugar, the flour, baking powder, salt, and the cornmeal. And I'll put it all into the bowl together, and then we'll mix it one more time. Okay, so 1/2 cup of sugar. I'm putting my dry ingredient into this red measuring cup, and 2 halves makes a whole. So I'm using 1 whole cup of white sugar. And then I'm going to use 1 cup of flour, but double this, so 2 cups of flour. So again, I'm actually using the same measuring cup. I didn't even wash it because I'm not scooping with it or dumping. I'm just putting something into it. So that was 1 cup. This is 2 cups. And again, we're gluten-free. So this is a gluten-free powder called Cup for Cup. And basically what that means is I can use this flour in any recipe that's designed for gluten eaters, and it has the needed ingredients to make up for the missing gluten in the flour. I need 1 1/4 cup yellow cornmeal. So 1 cup and 1 cup is 2 cups, and 1/4 and 1/4 is 1/2. And so this is 1 cup of yellow cornmeal. And this is 2 cups of yellow cornmeal. And then I'm going to use my half because it was 1 1/4. So 1/4 and 1/4 make a half. The recipe says 1 tablespoon of baking powder. So I'm going to get my scoop. And it's got this little edge, so I kind of drag it out and flatten it while I'm doing it. I'm almost out of this can of baking powder. So throwing it in. Get every little bit. I can't go to the store with coronavirus, so we're just going to live with a little less if we have to. So because I ran out of baking powder, I was a little bit worried about the way the cornbread would like rise as well as congeal together. And so a substitute for baking powder is lemon juice, sour milk. You can even use like a yogurt. You can use cream of tartar, which I happen to be out of as well, which is random. So I had lemon juice in the refrigerator, so I'm just going to add 1 tablespoon of lemon juice, and I'm pouring it on top of the baking powder. It would have been better if I had mixed them separately, but basically what happens, and I'll show you, it's a chemical reaction. So you can see the white part in my bowl is starting to bubble, and that's the lemon juice and the baking powder reacting, which is what happens when you add water to your baking powder. Is it creates a chemical reaction, and then carbon dioxide is what's going to fluff and make your bread and your baked good light. Okay, so then lastly, I needed 1/2 teaspoon of salt. I never pour my salt over my food because I don't want it to be extra salty. So 1/2 and 1/2 makes 1 teaspoon, and I pour that in. And now that I have all of my ingredients, I'm going to mix them using my hand mixer. Cornbread is thick, so as you're mixing, it's actually even thicker than like a cookie dough. So it's a pretty thick mix, and because you've added cornmeal, it's a little dry. Cornmeal tends to be a little bit of a harsher grain, very dry. So you want to mix well, scrape the sides with a spatula, and then mix again. So the traditional recipe that I posted serves an 8x8 pan. So remember, I doubled it. So if you look, this is like a 9x12 pan. So it's not quite big enough to do the double servings. You could have extra thick cornbread, but I would rather have 2 pans. So I didn't have a second square pan, so I'm going to use my round cake pan, which is about an 8-inch diameter. So so you can see they're about the same size. So I'm going to split my batter into both of these pans. So I'm going to spray my pans. And then I'm going to put the batter in. So I'm putting 1/2 of my cornmeal into each of these pans. And if you're baking gluten-free like we are, one of the things that we do is we let any of our cakes or muffins, cupcakes, any of these kinds of things, these breads, we let our batter sit for an extra like 20 minutes before we ever put them in the oven. And that's again because without the gluten in the grain, it tends to be a little bit dry, and so when you let it sit, it has a chance to absorb the moisture from the milk and the eggs and the butter, and then what we find is when we eat it, it doesn't taste as grainy. And so often people that come over to our house and don't realize that we're a gluten-free family, they don't know that they're eating gluten-free because they can't really taste the difference. And so it's kind of a trick to baking. And I find that that when I even tell like my gluten baker friends to do the same thing, they think it makes their cakes fluffier. So so when you're making something, you might want to think about letting your batter sit for about 20 minutes before you actually stick it in the oven. So our pans are ready. I had preheated the oven already to 400 degrees. You can see our chili is in the crock pot. It's boiling. It's ready to go. We like to serve our chili sometimes over rice. So there's rice in that pot that's done. And now our cornbread is going to bake at 400 degrees for about 20 minutes. And so I'm looking for the color, which is golden brown, which it is. And then you want to take a toothpick, and I always try to aim for the center. It should come out perfectly clean. If it does, then your cornbread is ready. So I'm going to pull both of these guys out, let them cool, and I'm going to take one to the table for dinner. So this is what it looks like when it comes out of the oven, nice and golden brown. And you can see that we enjoyed it for dinner. I hope you do too.